Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Million Dollar Body Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Palmer. And if you're here, it's probably because you're a high performer, real estate agent, or a business owner that's interested in maximizing your physique, your finances, and your family time using fitness and nutrition as force multipliers in your life. If you're not already a part of the Facebook group, definitely go to n8trainingsystems.com/group. That's where we stream these podcast episodes every Tuesday. You can join in and ask questions. There's a ton of cool stuff happening in the group, as well as a massive amount of free content and resources. Again, go to n8trainingsystems.com/group to join us there. If you're already in the group and watching us live, we're excited to have you because today we're talking to Andrew Allemann about how to grow your following, your network, and build a business using podcasting. So super excited to dive in today with you. So
Andrew, I'm excited to be on a podcast called The $1 Million Body. My wife's going to get a kick out of that. So
we're super glad you're here. So you founded a website called podcastguests.com, right?
Yes, that's right.
And how long have you been doing that for?
That was 2016. So it's coming up here on 5 years sometime this year. And I've been podcasting for a lot longer than that. It's a service that I created because I needed help with my podcast. And so it's been podcasting for 6 years now, a little over 6 years, and then running podcastguest.com for about four or five.
That's super cool. I always feel like the best business ideas are the ones that are stemmed from like an actual need in the marketplace, where you see something and you're like, you know what doesn't exist right now? A place to link up podcast hosts and podcast guests.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I created it, right? So I started my podcast, and my podcast is about domain names of all things. And so after about a year, so 50 episodes, I was like, man, I've really tapped my Rolodex. I've invited all the people on that I know that would be interesting. How can I find new and different interesting guests for my show and kind of broaden the horizons, if you will? And so I looked around to see if there was a service for that. And there are a bunch of agencies that will help you, and they charge a lot of money, as they should, because they're literally, cold emailing, picking up the phone and calling and that sort of thing to find guests. But I thought, what if I just create a platform that's free to use and invite a bunch of other podcasters to use it? And that was the genesis of podcastguest.com.
That's excellent. And you kind of originally built it out as like a place for you to get more like awesome guests on your show.
Well, I mean, that was the purpose I was solving, but I was trying to help everyone else at the same time. So I went out and got about 100, 200 podcasters. I just emailed them all individually and said, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm running into this challenge with my own podcast. Maybe you are too. If you are, will you sign up for free for my service, and we'll try this out and see what works. And it did work within, the first time I sent it out, after I got it up to a couple hundred people, we started making connections between podcasters and guests. People were excited, and then it started to grow from there.
And I've subscribed to your newsletter now for probably about 18 months. And I've only really been a part of like the directory and had a profile on there for the last couple months. But if you want like to get connected and actually meet some more guests for your podcast, or like expand your network, if you just go to podcastguests.com, you can join in with like 25,000 other users just for free. And Andrew emails out this awesome email every single Monday with some great like featured experts. He's got some, and then they'll be like, hey, here's some podcasts that are looking for guests. And then here's some other, like a list of guests if you wanted to invite them onto your show. So it's this amazing resource. And like you said, there are agencies that'll do this for you, but it's quite expensive. And if you can just get on your mailing list and get all that for free, it's awesome.
Right. And most people use it for free. I encourage everyone to sign up, whether you're a podcaster or a guest, even if you don't intend on ever spending any money on it. Because 97% or so of the people that are on it use it for free, and they use those lists each week to pitch themselves to get on podcasts, and they're successful at it too.
So I feel like one of the things that I think prevents people, specifically people I've talked to, from like pursuing podcasts or trying to get on a podcast to grow their following or grow whatever they do, is kind of like that imposter syndrome. Like they don't feel qualified. So like, can you talk me through this a little bit, Andrew? Like, how would you, like, if you're like, I've never been on a podcast before, I don't even know if I'd make a good guest. Like, how would you put yourself in a position to get on a great podcast and be a good guest? And I know that's kind of a...
Yeah, no, there are a couple of things I'd say to that. And so first of all, people, it's normal to be a little bit nervous about doing something like being on a podcast, right? It's being recorded forever. And so, but in the stack of all the things you do publicity wise, I think it's pretty low risk, right? It's a lot less riskier than going, say, on a radio show. And I know we're streaming this live, but that's fairly unusual for a podcast. So most podcasts, it's being recorded, it's being edited. So if you really make a big mistake, it can be cleaned up. It's definitely less risky than going on live TV or even stepping onto a stage somewhere. So I encourage people to look at it as an opportunity to grow their voice, right? So maybe you're nervous about public speaking. Podcasting is really a great way to get better at it. The only way you can get better at it and more comfortable is to do it over and over again. And there are over 1 million podcasts out there, many that are a fit for you. And so being on those podcasts is a great way to get that practice. And when it comes to that imposter syndrome, that's a tough one, right? I think I know I suffer from that. A lot of people do. Think about what you're what you are good at, what your niche is, what your expertise is. And if you look at the whole world, you're automatically, if you have any expertise in something, you have more expertise than 99% of the world, right? And then you kind of keep moving up from there. And so what I tell people is to start by creating a one sheet, which is a pitch about you. And it basically says, usually you have your photo on there, you say what your expertise is, and then you go into details like, do you have any certifications, or maybe it's years in the business or years as an expert on that, or you've been published somewhere. Maybe you've been on a podcast, you've been quoted in a publication, something along those lines. Those are all things to put on that one sheet. And then as you kind of dig into that, I think you'll realize what level of expertise you have. So maybe you have that imposter syndrome, but as you start writing this out, you're like, hey, this is actually pretty interesting. I'd like to interview me if I wanted some information on this topic. And I tell people too, don't be concerned about getting too specific. I think a lot of people want to be this everything to everyone, right? So I see a lot of business coaches and personal coaches and that sort of thing. But the ones that have a lot of success are more specific, right? I'm not a business coach. I'm a business coach to people in the food industry and or consumer packaged goods or food who are, working on their second business in the space and are located in the Midwest, right? Or something like that, just very specific like that. Because then when people see that, they're like, oh, wow, that's perfect for me, as opposed to, oh, that's just one of 1,000 people that fit this mold.
That's really good advice. And I really love what you said about the one sheet in terms of writing out your accomplishments, writing out things that you're good at, and writing out like your kind of your accolades. Cause then you look at it and it will give you that boost of confidence that maybe like if it wasn't your name on the top of that paper, you'd be like, hey, this person's super qualified.
Exactly.
And I also really liked about talking about public speaking, because I do think that not only like is public speaking quite important as a business owner, but finding your voice is like crucial to growing your business and actually knowing what to say and how to say it and what ways resonate and what ways sound totally stupid, which I know a lot about the latter.
Right.
But
Right.
like the more you say stuff, the more you are able to like project that out there, like the smoother you get and the cleaner
The
it
more
gets.
confident you get, and because you will be confident, right? It's not just an appearance, it's you've done it over and over again, right? You've said the same thing over and over. So that makes you confident when you say it.
So for those of us who have not kind of reached that level of confidence or expertise yet, like, so I booked a podcast. I reached out to someone on your site and okay, they're going to interview me. I've never done this before. How do I get prepared to be a really good interviewee?
Right.
Yeah.
So there are a couple things to do. One is on kind of the technical preparation, literally technology, and the other one is being prepared to answer their questions. So on the technical side, there's not a lot you need to do when you're just starting out. You can always upgrade, right? It's like photographers, right? They can always upgrade to the newest, latest, and greatest camera, but there's diminishing return. And so what I tell people is, one, find a quiet place. Occasionally you'll have a podcast guest who calls in from the park or an airport when we were traveling, right? And that's not good. You want to be in a quiet place. Most of us are working at home now. Tell your family, hey, you can be recording this podcast. Things happen, right? If I get a package right now, my dog will go berserk, but try to limit those things as much as possible. And I always encourage everyone to get some sort of external microphone. You don't need to spend a lot of money. You can spend $30, $40 on a Yeti Snowball if you want to upgrade to something like this, which is the Oh, it's the Yeti.
Blue?
It's the blue Yeti. Yes.
Yours is fancier because yours is upside down though.
Yes. I got the boom arm here just to make it easier. But these aren't that expensive, but it makes a huge difference in your voice. And so it makes a huge difference in your presentation, which is very important. So external mic for sure. And then when it comes to preparation for the interview, it's always good if you can at least listen to part of that podcaster's previous interviews and get a flavor for it. For example, I was a little bit nervous at first about coming on your podcast because I don't have any background in health and nutrition. But then I saw, oh, look, he's interviewing other people that can help people that are in a similar field. And so that made me a lot more comfortable coming on the show. So ideally, you have that. You also, if the person, I always ask the podcast interviewer, I say, hey, is there anything in particular you want me to prepare for? Because in some cases, depending on what you do, they'll ask for specific data. And it's good to have that on hand, because if you don't have that type of information on hand, then the interview can go a little bit haywire. But those are the basic things to prepare to be on a podcast.
That's great advice. And I like what you said about just making sure that you ask in advance. So that way someone's like, hey, I'm gonna actually put you on the hot seat and we're going to talk about these sorts of things, that you're ready. But I appreciate you coming on, even though this wasn't a totally business related podcast.
Oh, no. I love doing these because, it helps me out too, right? It helps me get better at talking, at doing podcasts. But, another thing on the technical side is if the podcaster doesn't tell you, ask them if it's going to be on video, because a lot of podcasters like this, we're on video now. And so I'm like, well, maybe I should shower, or at least put on a decent shirt before I come on here. It's important to know. It's a very important thing to know. And also what platform you're going to be using. So you sent me a Zoom link for this. That's great. I knew, again, sometimes people will send you a Zoom link, but they aren't going to record it and you're not going to do video. So that's good to know. But sometimes people will use like Squadcast, or I use Skype when I record mine, which are audio only. And it's good to know what technology you're using ahead of time.
That's good. Yeah. Because otherwise you're like, hey, can you hear me? Or is this working? Or I forgot my Skype login.
Exactly.
7 minutes
Oh, and
behind.
even if you have a nice Yeti mic like you have, you're doing another great thing, which is you have earbuds in. And if you don't do that, you can get these nasty echoes. So that's another thing. Just grab your standard pair of headphones, plug them into your laptop, or the Yetis, you can plug them sometimes right into the side of the mic.
Excellent. So in terms of okay, you're like, we've been a guest on a couple podcasts. We're growing our network a little bit. We're getting more comfortable with it. At what point is it a good idea to start our own podcast?
That's a big leap. As you know, Nate, it's a lot of work. Now suddenly you're scheduling people as guests. You're also probably doing some sort of editing. You're doing this, coming up with questions to ask them, that sort of thing. So I always encourage people to do a lot of the guest side before being a podcaster, because you'll see that even as a guest, it's a bit of work. You have to prep for the interview, getting set up technically, that sort of thing. It's a lot of work, and being a podcaster is even more work. So I tell people, first be a guest for a while. If you really like that and you enjoy it and you see yourself being on the other side of things, then by all means, go for it. There's a little bit more you'll probably want to spend, but you can start again just with that nice microphone, right? That's kind of the threshold, the minimum viable podcast, if you will, to kind of get going. So, and then also think about what you want to get out of hosting your own podcast. And this is something I think a lot of people get into it and they're like, I'm going to be Joe Rogan. I'm going to have this huge audience and I'm going to sell ads, and then someone's going to come buy my podcast for $100 million. And the reality is podcasting is a very crowded space. And I think people that go in with the hope of building this massive audience will mostly be disappointed. I think the reasons to go into podcasting are to grow your own audience, right? So growing your expertise, and then the ability to have conversations with people that you wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to chat with. If I call someone up who's the CEO of a public company, he or she, and I say, hey, can I talk to you for 30 minutes? I just want to, learn from you. They're going to be like, no, or they're not going to respond. But if I say, I'd like to introduce you to my podcast audience to share your wisdom, then suddenly they get excited, right? So that's another big benefit from it. People that have their own product or service to sell, I think can get value out of being a podcaster as long as they don't push it too hard, right? You can mention it at the open. Oh, this is, by the way, I'm so-and-so with this, and at the end, but you don't want your podcast just to be about selling. Otherwise people will tune out.
That's great advice. I think that I got too many people. I think what like just jump into a podcast without necessarily thinking out the one big question is, what do I want out of that? Right.
Right.
Because what's the average? I think I heard that the average podcast stops after 8 or 18 episodes, something like that.
I would believe that because before we feature a podcast in our newsletter, we require them to get to 10 because a lot of people submit their brand new podcast and then we check back 3, 4, or 5 months later and they've done 3 or 4 and they gave up. Another thing is the median number of downloads per episode. I don't know what the latest is, but it's under 200. So, these audiences aren't massive, but I would turn that around and tell people, if you could go speak in front of an auditorium with 100, 200 people every week, would you do that? And most would say yes. I mean, I know there are lots of people out there that wouldn't, right? Anything smaller than 1,000 or 10,000 isn't interesting to them. But to have that sort of it's an intimate conversation in some ways, right? Because that's a small group. You're in their ear. It's one-on-one, so it can be a very effective medium.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And yeah, for me, if you're asking me like, hey, you want to speak in front of 200 people like this week, the answer is always going to be yes, because like
Yeah.
it's a chance to get out in front of not just like a Joe Rogan style audience, but like a niche audience that you described earlier, of people who actually like vibe with you, who are looking for what you have, and I feel like just like for the $1 Million Body podcast, it's the interesting intersection between like where business building and like body, like building your body kind of meet.
Right. Right. Yeah. And one thing I tell people too is not to focus on getting on the biggest podcasts around. Focus on those ones where your audience is, right? Focus on the ones that are very specific, where people will be interested in hearing what you have to say. I'd much rather speak to an audience of 100 or 200 people interested in what I have to say than tens of thousands that are interested in something else, right?
Any tips for us for if we're looking for more of those podcasts that might not be kind of the big names, but actually have our ideal clients or ideal customers in front of that are listening?
Right. Podcast discovery is kind of tricky. It's gotten better over the years, but it has been something that, even in Apple Podcasts until recently, your searching was basically searching the title of the podcast. So that can be tricky. You can go to Google and search for topic name podcast is one way to do it, but a lot of it's just word of mouth. And, it amazes me how many podcasts there are out there about very esoteric niche items. And, I feature them in my newsletter, right? And it's fun. I actually have someone who helps now, who puts it together. And every time I'm going through, I'm like, wow, there's a podcast about this, or there's a podcast about that. And so it's amazing what's out there. And I think once you get on one of those shows too, you might hear from some similar shows that are like, hey, do you want to be a guest on our show? I know I was on the Side Hustle Nation podcast, which is a pretty popular one. And then I started getting emails from all these other people that had smaller, but still good podcasts in a similar category that started reaching out to have me on their show.
Excellent. So kind of finding that one big domino and maybe going from there, seeing like what they have in common, what other podcasts are related to those. And then just, if you can get as a guest on there, hopefully you'd snowball from there.
Is if you get on podcasts, you do a good job and you help promote those shows after you're on them, which makes the host very happy. That really helps you out. And in fact, if you do a great job of promoting that show after you've been on, you might get invited back onto the same exact podcast, because that podcaster, we talked about fewer than 200 downloads per episode on the median. So podcasters are hungry for an audience, and it's hard to grow your audience. So if you have guests who come on who are focused on helping you promote it, then that will help you grow your show. The podcaster's happy. Like, I'll include this show in my newsletter, which will go out to over 25,000 people, right? So that's a benefit to you as a host. And some will listen, some will subscribe, not everyone, obviously. But that's a benefit to you as a host. And that's one thing I tell people to put on their one sheet as well. I was at the South by Southwest festival in Austin a few years ago, ran into a friend who's a podcaster, and he said, I get pitched every day from people that want to be on my show, and it's all me. What I'm this great person. You should have me on your show. They never tell me what they'll do to help me promote my show. And so as soon as he said that, I went back, and on podcastguests.com, you can create an online one sheet. And I added that in there. What will you do to help promote the shows that you're on? And that's something that I know that podcasters that go through the directory look for. They want to see someone who they believe will help them promote their show after they're on.
Okay, that's great to know. Because I know that like as a few times if I have like a guest on and then I'm like, hey, here's the podcast episode, and then they're kind of radio silent. You're like, oh well, that was a little bit of a bummer, but
And some people will promote your show more than others. And this is actually also kind of an interesting one. A lot of people, as a podcaster, they want to get the big name on their show, but you'll find that the smaller names are probably the ones that'll help promote you more. Like if it's someone who's on 5, 10 podcasts a week, and this is no big deal to them, you're lucky if they retweet, right, the podcast episode out. You're lucky, as opposed to someone who's super excited to be on it. They do a couple of these a month, and they'll actually go out and promote it maybe to their email list or to Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, that sort of stuff. And sometimes, sometimes the guest will decide it wasn't a great episode. They didn't do their best. And so that might be why they're not promoting it too much. So I always, I'm always cognizant of that. But I think in general, you'll find that someone who promotes one show heavily that they're on is a good guest to invite on your own show, because they're going to help promote it.
that's a really good call too when you're looking for great guests to have on.
Right. So if you see someone who's promoting the heck out of a podcast appearance they were on, then that's someone you should be like, hey, come on over. Let's be on my podcast. So
That's a great tip. That's gold right there, Andrew. How about this? Like beyond just promoting a show, like if like as a guest, what are like some of the things that you can like that you can do that provide value for the show that you're on? Like in the form of like, maybe it's like a book giveaway or like creating something branded for the host. Like, do you have any other like best practices there that can help provide a lot of value for the audience that you just spoke to?
That's a good question. If you are an author, I think that makes a lot of sense to maybe give away a copy or two to some of the listeners on the show. You can even tie that into something like, hey, if you sign up for my email list this week, and in the section, how'd you hear about us, mention this podcast, I'll enter you in to win this book or something along those lines, or another prize. I do caution people to be careful though, that they don't come across as just being there to promote. And authors obviously going to promote their book. That makes sense. That's why they do interviews. But sometimes you'll get someone on who's like, let me tell you about my 5-step system to get rich overnight, and, oh, you just need to download my course, that sort of thing. And that never plays well. And you're not going to get invited back onto that show. And if someone else sees that podcast, they're not going to invite you onto their podcast. So it's fine to promote. That's part of the purpose. The podcaster knows that, the audience knows that, but you need to do it tastefully.
Yeah, because audiences these days are super sophisticated. So if you're just there like pounding, like download my thing or get my master class, whatever, people are going to respond negatively to that.
Master class, mastermind, all these sorts of internet marketing type terms that we hear.
Can't get enough of those words. Awesome. That's extremely helpful. Is there any other like mistakes that you see either people who are kind of new to podcasting or new to being guests on podcasts make?
Yeah, I would say they're kind of the opposite of the tips I've given, right? So some of the mistakes I see are having a bad sound setup. And again, the threshold is not that high. You don't need to spend a lot of money, but doing it in a quiet place, external mic, external earbuds as a start. Now I've significantly advanced. I've spent a lot of money now to improve my sound quality and that sort of thing. But you get 90% there for under $100. Not being prepared is another thing, not understanding the format of the interview, listening to a little bit of the previous podcasts when you're on them, before you're on them. And then not fun, I think I tell people your job isn't done when the podcast is over. You need to help promote your appearance. And that's not just to help the podcaster and make them happy. That's also to promote you, right? I mean, I get some value out of promoting this to my email list too. Hopefully people listen, they get some tips. Maybe they stick around with my service longer because they understand some of the value, more of the value of being a guest on podcasts. So I'd say don't just interview and then think I'm done. Okay, that's it. Move on to the next one. Do what you can to promote that show afterward.
Your job's not done when the interview ends. I like that.
Exactly.
Okay, so thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you jumping on with us. You want to leave us with a hot take or maybe a story about a podcast gone awry?
Oh man. Well, let me actually do something a little bit more positive than that.
All right.
So it's funny who you can run into in interview being a podcaster. So I podcast about domain names, which is something that most people are probably saying, wait, there's a podcast about domain names. But I actually interviewed, of all people, David Ellison, the bassist for Megadeth. And he had a domain name story. I had a friend who sat next to him on a plane, and he started talking about how Megadeth had like one of the first banned websites on the World Wide Web. And my friend's like, you got to talk to my friend Andrew. And he came onto my podcast, and it was a lot of fun, right? Because you can have new, interesting, different guests, and you never know where those connections are. So it can be a lot of fun having a podcast, and you can make a lot of great relationships out of it.
That's awesome. That's a super cool story.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll throw some of the links to podcastguests.com into the show notes here. But any other way that people can get in touch with you?
Sure. I always tell people all the emails that come out of podcastguest.com. Well, when you sign up, it comes from my email address. You can always just reply, and that's Andrew@podcastguests.com.
Cool, man. Well, I just really appreciate your time and your wisdom today. I think I was definitely asking you questions that were selfish in nature. So
That's great. That's great. That means other people have them too. So I appreciate you having me on, Nate.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us today, brother.
Likewise.